Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlon Bowling with you, and I am honored to be treated to talk with Tom Dorr today. Tom he almost needs no introduction. He's well known across the Ag Belt. He had been USDA Undersecretary for George W. Bush in his administration. He also has been the CEO of the U.S. Grain Council or Grains Council, and he joins us right now to talk about a very important topic. Before we dive into it, I want to remind you as you watch this, be sure to like this video and subscribe to this video and share it with others too to help get the word out. Appreciate that. All right, Tom, we had some recent developments, and it's related to the ethanol industry, and things were looking better there for a while about potential demand for U.S. ethanol through the sustainable aviation fuel sector. It looked like we could be looking at all kinds of demand, and now it appears that there may be a monkey wrench thrown in there, and I want to get your thoughts on this because this is something near and dear to your heart, right?
Well, yes, and uh, I've read some of that information as well. I would start out by saying that it appears that it is not a lot different than perhaps what had been agreed earlier, and therefore perhaps the Biden administration hasn't gone as far south as one would originally expect from reading the latest press releases. But the real issue is that we are approaching some fairly significant lows in the corn and soybean market again, based on levels that we've not seen since 2021, late 2020. The simple fact of the matter is that the U.S. market development initiatives are not keeping up with the production capabilities globally. The U.S. at one point was the major exporter of corn. I think last year our role in that market was about 42% of all exports. China is now exporting 2 times as many soybeans as we are out of the U.S. on average. And the simple fact of the matter is that we have flatlined consumption of animal protein in this country at about 210 pounds a year for some time. It would appear that exports in both corn and soybeans, in the traditional sense, have leveled off since 2011. From the year 2000 to 2011, there was pretty significant growth in both of those, but frankly, they're pretty level. The interesting aspect of all of this is that the whole development of biofuels was probably the most significant new market development strategy that occurred within both the corn and the soybean industry back in the late 90s. It started actually earlier than that, but it manifested itself into a real business in the early aughts of the 2000s. Interestingly enough, it created a lot of concerns by a lot of people, including agriculturists who had high cost corn for livestock feed, et cetera. But the simple fact of the matter is, what we've now figured out is that we can probably produce 15 to 20% through biofuels of all the liquid fuels we need, whether it's jet, whether it's biodiesel or diesel, gasoline. And what we're not recognizing is that unless we do that, unless we aggressively go after that, and we have the acres to do it without necessarily bringing into production acres that don't need to be brought into production, but unless we do this, we're going to resort to dependency on traditional 10-decade-old farm policies that, frankly, should go by the wayside. I don't know any other industry that operates using policies that are 10 decades old. And the simple fact of the matter is that the 2023 Farm Bill looks like it's got a real challenge. The number of agricultural congressional delegates that we have are significantly lower than we've seen in the past. And so I think that it's going to be upon us to look at these new initiatives. I'll stop there because I think the whole issue with carbon in and of itself is a dramatic new resource that we haven't even begun to really comprehend what it is that we're capable of doing, particularly if we capture it off of ethanol plants and begin to sequester it. I may have rattled on too long and you may have questions.
When this first came out, that they thought maybe they could make sustainable aviation fuel out of ethanol. My initial thought was, yeah, that's a cute little niche that might be worth something to talk about. But it actually could be quite a large industry, couldn't it?
Yeah, the jet fuel industry is probably going to consume globally around 85 billion. I'm sorry, that may be just a US number. I think globally it's 85 billion gallons, but I think it's probably more than that. We consume about 135 billion gallons of gasoline a year and about 45, 46 billion gallons of diesel fuel. And what's really interesting is that when you look at what the major petroleum companies are doing, particularly groups like ExxonMobil, they're taking a very hard look at what biologicals are able to do relative to sequestering carbon and producing additional quantities of liquid fuels for them. And they're using a variety of products that they're trying to make it out of, whether it's dissolving sawdust into liquid fuels or whatever the case might be. But when you look at the efficiencies of the system, particularly in the food and the fiber and the fuel sector, by converting soybeans, I mean, we're only going to be able to export about 1.5 to 1.8 billion bushels of soybeans a year. We've got the capacity to probably produce something in the neighborhood of 5.5 billion over the long term. We could probably put close to 200 million acres into crops that are used to produce fuel and yet still produce a food or a protein source addition. Now, that's not new. Everybody's known that. But the simple fact is that whether you agree with the whole issue of needing to sequester carbon or not, that's baked into the cake. There is nothing we can do about it. And when people look at the ability to gather 10 to 15 to 20 million metric tons of pure liquid CO2 in a way in which these pipelines, like Summit Ag, are proposing, this in and of itself is an incredible new resource that's going to be used in a whole new tranche of products. And so it goes back to when we came out of the grain surpluses of the late 50s and the early 60s. What did we do? We got busy and started looking for new markets. It was great coming out of World War II because until 1955, when the Common Ag Policy came into being, we were replenishing the world's food supplies. But Europe came back on stream very quickly, and we had subsidies that we had to deal with over there. And you go on down the pike, and finally, market development strategies started figuring out that we do have products we could sell, animal protein and grains, in the international markets. But interestingly enough, Russia now has approved GMO products. They're going to produce more corn. They're going to need less imported corn. You've got the Black Sea area. Those issues will be resolved at some point. You've got Brazil. We have to think creatively about the kinds of new products that we can produce sustainably, environmentally friendly ways, and ways that create economic value for the entire country.
What do you think we need to do to remove the roadblocks to using ethanol for this sustainable aviation fuel? What kind of obstacles do we have to overcome right now, in your opinion?
I think the big obstacle we have to overcome is simply the recognition that using biologicals such as corn and soybeans for products that are different than the traditional commodity programs and products that we've been used to over the last 50 or 60 years is not an abomination. It is not challenging the food industry. It's not challenging a number of other areas. What we are doing is finding out that, for example, a friend of mine and a guy that many, many people know, Harry Stein, has done a remarkable job in redefining the soybean and the corn research protocols that have resulted in substantial increases in soybeans. But his work in corn is what drove the short stature corns that are now evolving. And so instead of raising 25,000 plants per acre, we can put 40,000 plants per acre or 38,000 plants per acre. And we're producing exponentially greater quantities of corn. Probably we'll see yields increase on the average of 1.5 to 2 bushels per acre if things play out like I think they may. And all of that gives us a resource that has to be rethought and jerry-rigged to figure out what we can use it for in another fashion. And one of those that entrepreneurs like Bruce Rastetter and others that are now looking at in the context of sequestering carbon, and oil and gas is doing this, and they've been doing it to some extent for a long time. It's not new, but putting this pipeline infrastructure in is something that I think we overlook the value of it. When you have brand new infrastructure and you're running a high quality raw material initially to sequester it, to lower the carbon index of the fuels that are going to be needed for sustainable jet fuel, but ultimately may have the carbon itself may have other values, is something that probably you've got to be a dreamer. Perhaps maybe that's my problem. I'm too much of a dreamer, but I see what these things are going to do long term down the road.
Why would the green lobby be against this, Tom?
Well, I think the green lobby is against it for a number of reasons. Uh, agriculture is probably, and this is completely down a rabbit hole, but agriculture is, generally speaking, the singular largest last standing private property holder in this country. It used to be every mom and pop shop had their own building someplace. Now, all the buildings are owned by commercial real estate people. People have leases. But the local farmer gets up every morning, he goes out on his front porch, looks around and says, hey, I hope that crop makes it so I can make enough money when I sell it to get my kids to college, have a vacation, whatever. I got to make enough to pay the rent. This guy over here, I'd like to buy that guy's farm. But guess what? We've got a bullseye in our back because nobody is out there looking at us. And I believe that the green lobby, more than anything, is attacking agriculture, not because it's not sustainable, not because it isn't environmentally friendly, but because there's a lot of money out there that nobody is really protecting the landowner from, because the landowner thinks what they're doing is the right thing, consistently doing the right thing, as they have as long as I've known. And it's something that they just, quite frankly, have difficult comprehending why an environmental community, who, if you looked across the countryside, you would know better if you lived there, would be an enemy. I mean, when I came back to the farm in 1971, we had 1,500 head of cattle and probably 1,000 head of hogs, all running in open yards, and the manure was running in the road ditch down through the creek bed and down into the creek. When I left, all the cattle are in buildings, all the hogs are in buildings, and we're using nutrients as a resource that have as much value or more as the animal protein that we're producing in many cases. And we don't communicate those stories well outside of our own community. I think there's a narrative that we in agriculture have failed to develop, not because we don't mean well, not because we don't know it. It's because we just can't comprehend the kind of opposition that we have to deal with. And we have to figure out that we do need a narrative, and we do need to understand ways in which to communicate the value of all these things that we've done in the past and these new initiatives in the future can bring.
Yeah, it seems like it's all about control, and it sounds like that's another topic for another program where we need to talk more about that. Tom, I wish I had more time. I sure enjoyed talking with you, and maybe we can pick this up again at a later date and kind of continue our conversation here. But great stuff. Thanks for your insight today. That's Tom Dorr, former U.S. Undersecretary for Agriculture at USDA under the administration of George W. Bush. Well, thanks again, Tom, for joining us. That'll do it for this episode. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlon Bowling. Catch you next time on the Comstock Channel. Thanks for joining us on our Comstock YouTube channel. Don't forget, you can also find us on Facebook and TikTok as well.